Good evening. We're on session 2 with the framework of the covenants. Tonight we're going to be looking at the Abrahamic covenants, and we're going to be looking at 4 different passages: Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, and Genesis 22. Genesis 22 is where Mount Moriah comes into play, and so that's why that's listed there. Well, very good. Just so that we have it all together, a short recap from last week. We're looking at a history of the covenants, and it's an outline of the salvation history through Scripture, the Heilsgeschichte. Covenant is a contract or a bond in blood, and the verb in the Hebrew is to cut a covenant, or we say establish a covenant, but it is literally to cut a covenant, and that's where we hear that blood imagery really come in. And there's a promise, and then there's a curse if broken and a blessing if kept. One of the other things, especially when we deal with both the Adam and the Noah covenant, is that it uses mythic language. And once again, in our modern idea, we hear the word myth and we hear fable or lie. And I use it in the more academic context that it's a story to explain the unexplainable. Before you have science, you have myth. And every culture has creation myths to explain where the world came from, because they just didn't know. And so the myths were there to explain the unexplainable. And if you look at what happened in the Adam story, chapter 1 of Genesis, is God creates an order. And we get to the eating of the fruit of the tree of good and evil. We see that the disorder comes in. And the disorder continues to grow until we get to the time of Noah. And in the time of Noah, we see the disorder has become so great. God removes God's protective hands so that disorder comes flooding in. Now, once again, if you're thinking about a desert people who trusted in the providence of God, nothing is more terrifying than a flood that covers everything. It just is the idea of absolute chaos. And chaos is often described as a water monster, Leviathan. And so when we have this, we see that when chaos comes flooding in, that's when God's protective hands have been taken away. But then slowly, after the removal of the chaos, God puts creation back into order, and that's when we have the covenant with Noah and with all God's children and all of creation. It's not just with Noah, but it's with all of the created order, where everything's put back in its place. Their understanding, we are trapped by our concept of the world because we've been in outer space. We've been able to look back and take pictures. I saw a picture that was taken today from NASA. I get the NASA photo of the day, and there was a wonderful shot of planet Earth in all its glory. But in their day and time, picture the Earth as a flat disc that had cracks in it, and that's where the water would come up through the cracks in the earth, because we were floating in water. That's why the sky is blue, and above the earth is a glass bowl, a firmament that was there to establish the difference between the waters and the waters, as the Genesis account describes it. And there's a trap door where God can open it up and the rain can come down, and there's a trap door where the hail can come down out of heaven, or because we're surrounded by water, and God's kingdom, God's heavenly court is on the top of the dome, up in the sky. And so it was a very different understanding of the cosmos. Once again, a myth is there to explain the unexplainable. How is all of this the way it is? And so if you look at a lot of these stories up until the 11th chapter in Genesis, we see it in much more mythic language before we move into the stories we're getting into tonight. And once we get to Abraham, that's when I say, that's where there's a turning point, and it is much more historical in its context. Not entirely, but much more historical in its context than what we would have gotten before in chapters 1 through 11. Once again, the theological language for that is the historicity of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But we don't need to get into that. And so that gets us to chapter 12, which is where we're going to start tonight. I'm going to just do lip service to chapters 12 and 17, just because they're important. It's important for us to read them, but unless you have major questions, I'm not going to spend a lot of time we're really going to put all our energies on 15 and 22 tonight. And so I'm going to jump right in and just read the altar version, the second passage of Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Notice here, once again, for the folks that weren't with us last week, whenever the Lord is all capitalized, that is the proper name of God that was given to Moses on Sinai, Yahweh. I am who I am. Or not on Sinai, at the burning bush. Same guy, different part of the story. But that's when we get the proper name of God. Now notice it's coming into the story before we're given the name. And so that's part of the editorializing that has done when it was later written down. And last week we talked a lot about the different sources of
this altar then, does he recognize the same chapters as we do?
Yes.
This chapter 15,
yes.
He used the same structure?
Correct.
And verses?
Yes.
Because they were later additions.
They are much later additions given through Christian scholars in the Middle Ages. But they, just for convenience sake, we follow it, the same patterns, yes. So starting there with Genesis 12:1, and the Lord, Yahweh, said to Abram, notice he hasn't changed his name yet, go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who damn you I will curse, and all the clans of the earth through you shall be blessed. And once again, I invite you to dig through all the footnotes, but you'll see that structure of I'm making a promise. There's going to be blessings and curses that are involved with that. But if you were here on Sunday, I mentioned this next passage, the Genesis 15. This is for me, one of the most fascinating scriptures in the Bible. I wish we talked about it a lot more. We don't give it a lot of credit. It is cited in Joshua, Deuteronomy, the Psalms. It is repeatedly brought up in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. It's absolutely fascinating, the story. And once again, I'm going to read from the altar as we jump into chapter 15. The imagery here is fantastic and beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. After these things, the word of the Lord, Yahweh, came to Abram in a vision, saying, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, oh, my master, Lord, what can you give me when I am going to end going to my end childless? And the steward of my household is Damasek Eleazar. And Abram said, look, to me you have given no seed, and here a member of my household is to be my heir. And now the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one will not be your heir, but he who issues from your loins will be your heir. And he took him outside, and he said, look up to the heavens and count the stars, if you can count them. And he said, so shall be your seed. And he trusted in the Lord, and he reckoned it to his merit. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit. And he said, O my master, Lord, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, take me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old she-goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took all of these and clove them through the middle. Each set his part opposite the other. But the birds he did not cleave. And carrion birds came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them off. As the sun was about to set, a deep slumber fell upon Abram, and now a great dark dread came falling upon him. And he said to Abram, know well that your seed shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and afflicted 400 years. But upon the nation for whom they slave, I will bring judgment, and afterward they shall come forth with great substance. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in ripe old age. And in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And just as the sun had set, there was a thick gloom, and look, a smoking brazier with a flaming torch that passed between those parts. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your seed I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and Kenizzite and Cadmonite and Hittite, I think that was supposed to be Hittite, and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashites and the Jebusite. Yes, it was supposed to be Hittite. Sorry, there's a typo there. What's your initial reaction to this covenant ceremony? There's some neat things to pull out. Sorry?
Why didn't he have the birds?
They weren't that big. Well, if you're hacking at pigeons, it's, there's only so much. But they were sacrificed, but there were two of them. So I imagine that one was on each side. You need to imagine the symmetry of what they're going for here. Yeah.
That was actually Molly's question from Sunday.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's also a matter of burden anatomy that don't bleed easily. Breastbone doesn't separate easily with cutting through the breast.
Correct. Because structurally, that's right. Yeah, if you ever try to cut a turkey that way, yeah, it's not easy. What else jumps out?
A lot of killing to be done by one man to handle the animals and the birds.
There's probably a reason why he had to take a nap. The deep sleep came upon him before he started chasing off the carrion birds. It's fascinating. One thing that Alter does bring out is that so often in the English translation, they go to birds of prey, and that's not what it says at all. It is carrion birds. It's I mentioned vultures on Sunday, and that's where I got that from. Yeah.
But is he saying that they're going to be put in a land they do not know? Is that?
Right. So so the prophecy here is about Egypt.
Is this about Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't 400 years, was it? It was less than that.
Well, they were in the land of Goshen that long. Mm-hmm. What else? He talks about the fourth generation there. One of the things he brings out in the footnote is that the word there that they use is not the traditional word for generation, so it could be period of time. So 4 centuries, we would say centuries.
Because 4 generations will be about 80 years.
Yeah, right.
And not 400, yeah.
Yeah, and so that the word there, once again, he even recognizes is very ambiguous. What else?
Were all of those carcasses consumed? Did they disappear somewhere? Or there's no determination of what happens to them?
After the ceremony, we're not given that information. I'm guessing they were left to the earth, and maybe the carrion birds finally showed up, as they will. It's fascinating when this ceremony is brought up in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah and the Psalms. It talks repeatedly about how your body will be left and no one will be there to chase away the birds. It's and you have to remember, this was the way that contracts were made. Most people were pre-literate or illiterate. And so you needed something where nobody could question that, yes, this took place. One of the reasons why we have wedding ceremonies is so that everybody's there, your family and your friends, and say, I saw you make those promises. And that's exactly what we're doing with this rite, is that this is nobody can say, yeah, we didn't sign the contract. This is very clear. This is a bond in blood that is being made. Obviously, we see where the blood is that's involved here, and it's very clear. And the way that it would be done is that if you were making a contract with somebody, you would cut an animal in two. Both parties would walk through it. It would be a way that a peace treaty was being made. The conquering king would make promises. The losing king would make promises. They would both walk through the carcass. And basically they're saying, may this happen to me if I don't keep up my end of it, of what's being promised here today. We still keep it in our language. I swear on my mother's grave, or I swear on my mother's eyes, the older version of that statement, that may this happen to my mother if I don't keep my,
What's this
Blood
reference to
promise.
them?
yeah, exactly. A blood oath, yeah. Or blood brothers, Yeah.
So God made the flaming torch just go through the middle, like walking through for the
Yes.
signing his end of the covenant?
So, and notice that he's the only one that goes through.
Well, he's the only one that needs to, but yeah.
Well,
He's
yeah.
making the promise.
He's making the promise, right? And and that's but that's the thing. Even though this is a covenant with Abram, he doesn't require Abram to walk through the same way that he does. Abram asks the question, "How will I know that this is true?" And then God initiates the ceremony, and God passes through. If you look at the footnote for number 17, verse 17. I love what Alter says here. All this is mystifying and surely meant to be so, in keeping with the haunting mystery of the covenantal moment. It seems unwise to translate the images into any neat symbolism, and the same is true of the ominous carrion birds Abram drives off. There may be some general association of smoke and fire with the biblical deity. Maimonides notes a link with the Sinai Epiphany, the burning bush, and the pillars of fire and cloud in Exodus also come to mind. But the disembodied brazier or furnace, and I've always pictured it as a clay pot, one of those flaming lamps. And the torch are wonderfully peculiar to this scene. So what do they mean? We don't know. It's what God chose to use. The firelight in this preternatural after-sunset darkness is a piquant antithesis to the star-studded heavens of the previous scene. And so if you remember that, how he had taken him outside and told him to look at all the stars in the heavens, and that's going to be the number of your heirs, your seed, to use the altar language here. And then we have this vision of this flaming torch and this smoking pot that's going to take away that natural sensitivity of your eyes at night. So where he had seen the brilliance of the stars, it's being drawn down, and he loses his night vision with this vision of the smoking torch and the brazier moving through the carcasses.
Where did the Amorites figure into this?
I'm sorry,
Hang on, I lost the
correct.
The Amorites will be.
That they are not, yeah.
The iniquity of the Amorites. Where did?
And I meant to look that up and I forgot to. Sorry, because I had that same question. And I'm looking to see where it is. Look at the in the note to 7 through 21, right below verse 6. Since this covenant is sealed at sunset, it can scarcely be a direct continuation of the nocturnal scene just narrated. The two scenes are an orchestration of complementary covenantal themes. In the first, God grandly promises and Abram trusts. In the second, the two enter a mutually binding contract, cast in terms of legal ritual. In the first scene, progeny is promised. In the second, the possession of the land, together with the dark prospect of enslavement in Egypt before the full realization of the promise. So that's where it gets in there, the Amorites not being fully there. The first scene highlights the dialogue and rhetorical power of the divine assurance. The second scene evokes mystery, magic, the troubling enigma of the future. Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
And then, who is Eliezer of Damascus?
So that would have been his most senior slave. So his right-hand
Would
man.
just be-
Yeah. I think he talks about him as his major domo. It's the way Alter describes it in the notes here. Yeah, there at the bottom of verse 2's footnote, the enigma is compounded by the fact that only here is Abraham's major domo named as Eleazar, a West Semitic name, moreover, that would be surprising in someone from Damascus. So there's a lot of contradictions going on here. Yeah.
So is the enslavement part of the covenant, or would that have happened without the covenant?
I think it's just a prophetic, the way I understand it, is a prophetic prediction of you're going to come back and you're going to come to this land. It's not going to be easy, but in 400 years you'll get here. And it comes back to faith. That it's not going to come fast, but it will come.
So is it like a blessing and curse in the same?
Whenever there's a covenant, it's both and. Right. It's, or we would call it a mixed blessing. And but I've always been fascinated by this text. I remember in seminary when my professor first introduced it to me, I was just like, why have I never heard a sermon on this? And if you heard me on Sunday when I had the good opportunity to preach, I got some of my gumption out about it. It was powerful stuff. So we have this commitment ceremony, and we don't have a lot of the details yet, and that's why we're going to jump to 17. Anything else on 15 before we move on?
Just that it's completely one-sided. Abraham is not asked to make any promises. He's simply told, this is the covenant. Do this, do that, or don't do this, don't do that.
Right, and why Abram? God knows. Why did he pull him out of Ur? Because he chose him.
I mean, it's a covenant, not a contract.
Right.
Because a contract will be freely signed, by both parties.
And if you go back to 12, God commands, leave. He doesn't get a lot of say in this. Thankfully, he is faithful and he believes it, and that is reckoned to him as righteousness. But we are going to see a little more of the Abrahamic side of it as we get into the next two readings. That's why I included all four, because none of them on their own show the whole picture.
And just how important it is to have another generation. God knew that he needed to have that reassurance that his name would continue on.
Correct. And especially when we see the sign of the covenant, this is all about, to use Alter's word, the seed, the heirs. This is a covenant with a lineage, that they shall be God's people to be a blessing to the entire world. And once again, as we filter this through the framework of the covenants, we see that all of creation has been affected by this downfall of human sin. Look at the climate crisis that we're living in right now when we have the crazy storm we had on Saturday. As we see all of this put together, we have to see it, that this is God's way of redeeming all of creation, which as we move through the next four sessions, or three more sessions after tonight, you will see how this all does link together, and it tells a singular story. And the Abrahamic covenant here is a covenant of grace for the redemption of all people. But we see how God works with a single man and then a single lineage to affect all families and be a blessing to all people.
Do you think Abraham has the choice of saying no? Could he have rejected the covenant? That's obviously what if.
Well, if he had, we wouldn't have been reading about him. So it's one of those things where whatever is what was supposed to be, is the way the Gestalt approach.
If you could repeat that.
Did Abraham have a choice? Could he have said, no, I'm going to walk?
I think seed won out on that.
Right. He was.
If he sees everybody else treading, that, you know, he really wants to,
Yeah.
very badly.
And so then we get to chapter 17. And once again, I'm just going to walk through this. And I'm going to flag a couple things as we read it. As Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. And if you're my age, you remember an Amy Grant song from back in the early 80s called that. It's one of the oldest names of God. We think it means God of the mountains. Maybe. One reason why he doesn't translate it is because we're not sure. Walk in my presence and be blameless, and I will grant my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you very greatly. And Abram flung himself on his face, and God spoke to him, saying, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be father to a multitude of nations, and no longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you a father to a multitude of nations. And I will make you most abundant, fruitful, and turn you into nations. And kings shall come forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you through their generations as an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your seed after you. And I will give unto you and your seed after you the land in which you sojourn, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, notice that the name change has taken place. There's a thing called speech act theory, where once it is declared, it is. There's not a lot of people who have that power. Judges, priests, and God, and rulers. I mean, if you think about it, as soon as I say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, it's done. Until then, they are not married. After that, they are married. I have been given that authority by the state and by the church. The Commonwealth of Virginia is different. I have to get the authority from the state and the church. Most states, I don't. I just tell them I'm ordained and like, okay, you can do weddings here. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, I have to be licensed with the state and ordained by the church. The Commonwealth is a little bit different than a lot of places. But once God declares your name shall be, it is. When God said, let there be light, and there was light, and it was good. That's what we're talking about. A judge can declare, case dismissed. A king can declare, this is the law. And so there's not a lot of folks that have that type of authority in the world we live in, but we see an example of it here. And sorry, I pontificated, my apologies. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my commandment, and you and your seed after you through their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your seed after you. Every male among you must be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. 8 days old, every male among you shall be circumcised through your generations, even slaves born in the household, and those purchased with silver from any foreigner who is not of your seed. Those born in your household and those purchased with silver must be circumcised. And my covenant in your flesh shall be an everlasting covenant. And a male with a foreskin who has not circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his folk. My covenant he has broken. Oh, sorry, that's supposed to be a period, not a question mark. And God said, Sarai, your wife, shall no longer call her name Sarai, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will also give you from her a son, and I will bless him, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall issue from her. Once again, that's supposed to be a period. And Abraham flung himself on his face and laughed, saying to himself, to 100-year-old will a child be born? Will 90-year-old Sarah give birth? And Abraham said to God, what would that Ishmael might live in your favor? And if you remember what's happened here, Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar is the mother, Hagar was the handmaid, the TV show that's very popular right now, The Handmaid's Tale, from the Margaret Atwood book, takes the story idea from this idea that if you are barren, your handmaid can produce your heir for you, with a very disturbing ritual. But that they are allowed to claim that as their heir because they are owned. And so Abraham has already produced a male child that he assumed would be his heir through the handmaid and Ishmael. If you hear this story from our Muslim brothers and sisters, they follow the lineage of Abraham through Ishmael. This is where one of the great distinctions and disagreements between the sons of Abraham take place. Who is the true heir? The firstborn, Ishmael, or the heir through the married wife, Sarah? And that's one of the big bones of contention.
Or why not the major dome of the,
Eleazar, yeah. Yep. Well, as soon as there was an heir, he's out of the picture.
Right.
So he's superseded. But these are, if there's some wonderful work with Palestinian folks talking about how we are all blood brothers, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And it's some heartbreaking stuff. I mean, we are all so close in so many ways, even in lineage. And we look to Father Abraham as our father of the three great monotheisms of the world. And so many of the stories are very similar. So Abram argues for Ishmael, would that Ishmael might live in your favor. And God said, yet Sarah, your wife, is to bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Look, I will bless him and make him fruitful, and will multiply him most abundantly. 12 chieftains shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear you by this season next year. And he finished speaking with him, and God ascended from Abraham. Wow. So, what is the sign of the covenant? Circumcision, yes. And I'm not trying to get anybody uncomfortable here, but if you tie this understanding of that through this lineage, the entire world shall be redeemed and saved, the sign of the covenant is closely related to the sexuality and of the progeny that shall go on forever from Abraham. And so the sign of the covenant, we've already talked about the necessity for that to be in a blood covenant. And so he's establishing this blood covenant as a reminder. And it's circumcision has to do with the cleanliness of the male sexual organ. And so there's the idea of cleanliness around it. There's the idea of the sexuality around it, and the offspring that shall come from it, from the seed. Even that, once again, that's the language that's in the Hebrew. And coupled with that, when is the child circumcised? And most of the cultures that practice circumcision in that area and at that time, it would be a male coming of age ritual, which would happen at puberty. When does this happen? 8 days after. The kid's nowhere near sexual. I mean, it is truly to say, from this child's earliest days, he shall be marked as holy. And he shall have the sign of the faith covenant with God. And so that there is no question for your entire life, you are set apart. That's what the word holy means. And for this sign of a faith in God, from the child's earliest days to his last day, it will be marked in a most private, most precious way. It gets very uncomfortable sometimes when we talk about this, but there's so much symbolism packed into what they were trying to do. Now, circumcision was practiced in many of the cultures in that day and time, but to move it back to near birth, that we are recognizing their humanity through this initiation ritual of the bris. And so that is a lifelong covenant. It's not a choice of a fully pubescent male child. It is for his entire life and his earliest days. We just can't push enough the weight of what is being done here. If I made anybody uncomfortable, I'm sorry. It's hard to talk about phallic symbolism without being just direct about it.
Well, now I don't know people, except unless they're going to hold a dress. If they think about that, they might just think about matching the male grown up in the family or doing all kinds of stuff. It might not be, hey, you're continuing a covenant with God here.
Right.
You know?
And it up until recently has been a normal practice of American doctors, whereas European, it was not. And so the Jewish folks were exceptional. I've watched a lot of World War II movies, and that's one way they could always tell who the Jewish guys were, because other men would not be circumcised. And that was a way that the Nazis would check in the stories. I'm trying to think. Winds of War, Herman Wouk. That was one of the things that they talked about very explicitly. What else?
Blood sacrifice happens every generation, whereas the earlier ceremony with Abraham only happened once.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And this is the sign of, once again, so there's blood involved here, but this is the sign of the covenant. So like the rainbow for Noah, this is the sign of the covenant as a faith statement that is taken on by the humanity to say we accept our portion in this covenant by following this rite. Does the rite save them? No. Does the rite make the covenant? No. The covenant was made. It is the ongoing recognition that we are maintaining this covenant henceforth. Yeah.
But they threw in the enslaved people as well.
Right, because they were part of the household.
Yeah.
And one of the great traps of the influence of evangelical theology in our culture is the idea that we are saved individually, which ain't the case when you read this. Evangelical culture and theology pushes the idea of individual salvation. And what we're looking here is that with the idea of the covenant relationship with God, this is a covenant with a people and with all of their seed. So it's you and your grandpa and your uncle and your cousins and the guy you hired to be in your house, that works on the farm, it would include everyone that would come under your house, because as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord, as Joshua put it.
But all those descendants must obey the law.
Because the master of the house,
Yes.
right. And so this idea of individual salvation is just a concept they would not have had. And it's hard for us to separate because it's so steeped in our understanding. But this idea of a covenant relationship with a people and a nation, it's a very different understanding than what we've been seduced into in the last 200 years. Yeah. Anything else? Sorry. As you can tell, I enjoy these conversations. I hope that you'll go back and spend some more time with that. As we jump into 22, once again, I'm reading from the altar, the second reading. And here is probably the most pivotal story for our Jewish brothers and sisters. If you go back and you look at the archaeology of most of the synagogues that we found, and almost every one where there are mosaics, when they use mosaics to decorate, which is often how most of them were decorated, in the tabernacle where the Torah would be placed, in the back of that is a depiction of this story. It is the most common theme that is used, and it's the binding of Isaac is how they tell this story. Not the sacrifice of Isaac, the binding of Isaac. And so we're gonna get into this and look at some alternate readings, and we can wrestle with this and have some fun. Chapter 22. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take, pray, your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall say to you. And Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took his 2 lads with him. Not Isaac is one of the lads, but 2 of the people in his house. And Isaac his son. And he split wood for the offering and rose and went to the place that God had said to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to his lads, sit here with the donkey, and let me and the lad walk ahead, and let us worship and return to you. And Abraham took the wood for the offering and put it on Isaac his son, and took in his hand the fire and the cleaver. We're going to come back to the word cleaver there. And the 2 of them went together. And Isaac said to Abraham his father, Father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, here's the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the offering? Oops, sorry, another typo. And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for the offering, my son. And the 2 of them went together. And they came to the place that God had said to him. And Abraham built there an altar and laid out the wood and bound Isaac his son and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the cleaver to slaughter his son. And Yahweh's messenger called out to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not reach out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, and you have not held back your son, your only one, from me. And Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and look, a ram was caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh. Often you hear that Jehovah Jireh. As to this day, on the mount of the Lord is sight. And the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham once again from the heavens, and he said, by my own self I swear, declares the Lord, that because you have done this thing and have not held back your son, your only one, I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens and as the sand on the shore of the sea. And your seed shall take hold of its enemies' gates. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed because you have listened to my voice. And Abraham returned to his lads, and they rose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. This is quite the story. Even today, after all that waiting, after all that longing, after all of that, he gets this urge to sacrifice his son. Now, there's a lot of ways to read this. One would be that, take it very literally, that he heard this voice of God. One of my favorite alternative readings to the literal is that most of the cultures around there practiced sacrifice, human sacrifice, to appease the fertility gods, so the gods of Baal and other things. And because that's what was done, that's what you do, Abraham felt that this was what was being required of him. And God says, whoa, and stop. Either way you read it, Isaac is offered up. Either way you read it, God stops Isaac from being sacrificed. I don't think God calls any of us to to blood sacrifice in this way. And I think that that's why I like the alternate reading more. I do think the way I tend to read Scripture is that we have a continual unveiling of our understanding of God throughout Scripture. And that at this point, Abraham, we haven't gotten to Moses yet, Abraham was doing what Abraham thought was expected of him. Here's my turn to pay my half of the covenant that has not yet been asked of me. Circumcision, important, but not, deadly. There needs to be blood. And God steps in and says, the blood has been spilt that needs to be spilt. This understanding that there does not need to be a sacrifice on your part. I will provide. Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Yireh. God will provide. And God will provide the sacrifice. Now, as Christians, how do we read that? It's not a rhetorical question. As Christians, what is the sacrifice provided by God? Christ. Yeah, and we see that as the culmination of the story. That we are repeatedly being told, God's going to take care of it. God's going to take care of it. From Noah, I'm going to take care of it. To Abraham, I'm going to take care of it. To Moses, God's going to take care of it. To David, God's going to take care of it. And finally in Christ, God is taking care of it. With an idea of the covenants with God, we see him driving to this culmination, this crux point in history, where all of creation has been yearning and driving us to that point. And we see the framework of the covenants that way. We see that God's grace has been with us since the Noachic covenant, where all of creation was destroyed so that it could be recreated to get us to the point of salvation in Christ. And it's a very different reading when we read all of Scripture that way. And it's not a different Old Testament God, New Testament God, which I've so often heard, because that's what makes sense but when you read all of it together and you can see this line of promise and grace from even the earliest days, it's a very different way to tell the story, and a very different way to hear the story. And that this is what it's about. And we see this bond in blood, that even when he has the cleaver raised, the word there that is often used as knife is a very archaic, once again, read the footnotes on it, but it's a very archaic word for knife, and more likely it was a cleaver, as a butcher would use. And that's what's raised above Isaac as he's laying bound on the altar. Go ahead, Jeff.
Does altar address in any way that you can share with us the distinction that was made in 22? Three times, Isaac is described as your one and only, your beloved son. Does altar in any way refer back to 17, chapter 17, to make a distinction between Ishmael's family, Ishmael's position? We know
Right. Well, because now, once again, we skipped over the parts where Ishmael's cared for by God that's in the story,
Right.
because we're following this singular lineage.
Right.
But he does cover taking care of Ishmael. They have their own chapter, and I'm trying to remember which one it is, but it's in there. But the one thing about his one and only, if you look into the footnote for verse 2, your son, your one and only, whom you love, Isaac, this the Hebrew syntactic chain is exquisitely forged to carry a dramatic burden, and the sundry attempts of English translators from the King James Version to the present to rearrange it are misguided. He's saying this order is particular and unique. So he's getting into that one question that you were asking. The classical midrash, or commentary, followed by Rashi, beautifully catches the resonance of the order of terms. Rashi's concise version is as follows: your son, he said to him. I have two sons, he said to him. So this is in the midrash. This is what Rashi says. Your son, he said to him. I have two sons. God said to him, your only one. He said, this is an only one to his mother, and this one is the only one to his mother. He said to him, whom you love. He said to him, I love both of them. And he said to him, Isaac. So it's like there's this back and forth. Your only son. I have two sons. The one that you love, I love them both. And he goes, Isaac. And he actually names him. And that's why the order is so particular, according to this one rabbi, Rashi.
And Ishmael will have innumerable sons.
Right. From the 12 kings he births.
That
Well,
Isaac will then the stars.
the stars will be both lines, because they all are fathered by Abraham.
But the woman is the determining factor.
Right. The thread that we're going to follow is this thread.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're asking great questions. But no, I love this explanation that he brings out here. Although the human object of God's terrible imperative does not actually speak in the biblical text, this midrashic dialogue demonstrates a fine responsiveness to how the tense stance of the addressee is intimated through the words of the addresser in a one-sided dialogue. And then he goes on, you're only one. Some scholars, bothered by the technical inaccuracy of the term, which you brought up, thank you very much, have followed an ancient reading of Yadid, favored one, instead of the Masoretic Yahid. This seriously misses the point that in regard to Abraham's feelings, Isaac, the sole son by his legitimate wife, is his only one. The phrase, your son, your only one, will return as a thematic refrain at the end of the story in verses 12 and 16. Yeah. So, I mean, you're asking a great question.
I went to our wonderful library here today to look at the different Bibles. They didn't have a whole lot of Bibles in the public library. Fair enough, Lincoln probably has more.
Come to my house.
Or come to my office. I've got 20 different versions. Yeah.
I will. I'll take you up. Thank you.
Anything else from the binding of Isaac? Once again, this is so important. It's such a powerful text.
One of the phrases that comes to me, it's nothing really to do with covenant, is from the, even as a boy, I remember the phrase, here I am. Well, we know you're there. I mean, why is he saying that? And I guess it's just a literary trope.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think it means anything.
Well, it's just a recognition of I've heard your call. Yes.
But even the words "here I am," well, of course I know you're there.
Well, notice that God says it, and then Abraham responds. Isaac says it. He responds in the same way.
I think when they said that's talking about present, that it's aware. I'm here, I'm present, I'm listening to you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's not signaling, I'm a little bitty thing and I'm here.
Right. Well, often when my daughter says, Dad, 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 and I'll be looking at her and acknowledging it. And finally I say, yes, I hear you. Continue. Yeah.
Abraham is now 100-ish more. And I'm just-
Probably about 115 at this point.
Yeah, and I'm like, did he forget that, like, the last part of 17 that we cover is that my covenant will establish with Isaac. So God has plans for him, and I don't think they involve being sacrificed to him for appearing, but was he having a moment that, or just
Like I said,
hadn't heard from God in a while, or?
there are many ways to read this passage. One is just the very literal that God is testing him. And will he, after all of this, is he willing to do even this?
To give the legitimate job.
I have a hard time with God playing games like that, which is why I offered the alternative reading, that he thought this was what was expected. And God's like, whoa, I wouldn't ask that of you. That's the way I read it. Once again, that would be threatening to a lot of people, but we'll recognize it for what it is. I teach and preach both. Yeah. But for me, I don't think God plays games with us like that. That's a really cruel trick.
I just can't imagine what Isaac was feeling. That's, if you're roughly 15, 14 years old, and your dad just tossed you on a bunch of sticks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be feeling a lot of different things.
Exactly. You don't forget a cleaver over your head. If you're a fan of Star Wars, in the last episode, Luke Skywalker is about to kill Kylo Ren, and it scars him for life. And so I see there's a lot of that imagery in there. Our myths stay very similar, don't they? Yeah.
In all three of these covenants, and I ran through them, Abraham is asked to do different things each time, but the blessing that God's offering is the same. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Why does he have to enter the covenant 3 times then?
Once again, the way I read it, and one reason I included all 4, just so that we have them all, is a continual unveiling of the fullness of it. Because you're right, the promise is the same, and that's why I see it as one covenant. Think about different clauses in a contract.
Or just reminders that we have to give ourselves every day. Yeah, I said, you're gonna have all these children. I'm not kidding. You're gonna have all these children.
Yeah. But once again, God provides. And I see the great promise and grace, even in these horrible and fascinating stories. Yeah. Anything else? I try to keep it to about an hour, and we're right at that time. As we move into the Mosaic covenant next week, I think you're going to see a lot more as we get into it. This is where it's not just one person making promises for a people, it's a people making promises for a people. But it builds on the Noachic and the Abrahamic covenants. What happened in chapter 15 is foundational. It's the foundation upon which all of the rest of the covenants are built. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And that's the promise that carries us through. God is, and the other way to look at all of this is that God is trying to get us back to paradise. The first covenant with Adam, if you don't eat of this tree, you get to live in paradise forever. Oops. And everything else and all of what we're going to be talking about is God doing God's best to get us back to paradise. And that's where that wonderful phrase that we get from St. Paul, the fullness of time. In the fullness of time, we are finally getting back to the way the story had started and the way the story was supposed to end from the very beginning. Yeah. This has been great. Any last questions? All right. Well, next week we got another big conversation. The David week's a lot easier because it's a lot shorter. And then we're going to try to cram all of Jesus and Revelation into 1 week. So it's going to be tight. If there's a week to miss, it's week 4. But try to be here for 3 and 5. Yeah, all right. Very good.